Hello, everyone. Welcome. Happy to help launch Reading Week with this study break. And incredibly happy to have the crew here that we have to discuss some really important issues and topics that I think are incredibly important for the campus, and it turns out to be really important for a national conversation as well. If you don't know, my name is Shannon Jackson. I have the privilege of serving as Associate Vice Chancellor for the Arts and Design here at UC Berkeley, charged with serving as a connective function amongst a variety of creative organizations, departments, centers, venues, student clubs across the campus, joining them across disciplines, across various disciplines on campus and in community. One of the many ways that we routinely bring together constituents from different disciplines and community positions is through a series like this. Every Monday night in A+D Mondays, together with BAM-PFA, we're able to open the museum and welcome some kind of catalytic conversation co-curated by many departments and centers on campus. This year's theme for our routine A+D Mondays gathering is fact and fiction, with a lot of different ideas about what those two terms mean and what their relationship or non-relationship is. And we hear the terms differently depending upon those who are gathered here. And tonight we're going to hear them differently positioned by joining them to a wider conversation about the role of the so-called creative fields, of the arts, humanities, and design fields in STEM learning, STEM with two M's, including science, technology, engineering, math, as well as medicine. Very happily, the National Academies themselves engineered a multi-authored report on the vital role of this kind of connection, and asked at a recent DC gathering to have a chance to disseminate and circulate and hear feedback about these kind of integrative ideas. And it was really lucky that we at Berkeley were able to welcome them here, and even luckier that we had three of the top leaders of our campus able to join us in dialogue about the connection between integrative learning, the branches of the same tree, as Albert Einstein once called all of the fields across arts, religion, and sciences, to think about the relationship between that and what we do on this campus and the evolution of our curriculum and research about the future, especially of undergraduate education as well as graduate education in joining a variety of field sensibilities and skill sets. So we'll hear more about that tonight. And I hope that many of you saw all of that integration in action in the sampler display we had outside beforehand. Thanks and hats off to all of the incredible staff, students, and faculty who showed their wares to us earlier this evening. Thank you. Really great. So tonight we have an incredible, impressive array of people to think about these models. I'll very briefly introduce our distinguished panelists, five of them. Tom Rudin, first off, is the Director of the Board on Higher Education and Workforce at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Prior to the academies, Rudin served in senior positions at the College Board and at the National Institutes of Health. Irene Yun, as an Associate Program Officer also with the Board of Higher Education and Workforce at the National Academies, and serves as the Research Associate for the Committee on Women in Science, Engineering, and Medicine, as well as other posts. Paul Alivisatos, as many here in the room know, is Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost at UC Berkeley, a founder of our Nanoscience Institute, a professor, leading professor in nanoscience and nanotechnology, Emeritus Director of Lawrence Berkeley Labs, Berkeley National Laboratory, was Associate Vice Chancellor for Research, and is now serving as our Provost and as a key connector on so many fronts, operational and interdisciplinary. Randy Katz now serves as our Vice Chancellor for Research at UC Berkeley, where he provides primary leadership on research policy, planning, and administration for the entire campus. Since 1996, he has been the United Microelectrics Corporation Distinguished Professor in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and works on the design of large, complex networked applications and systems. And finally, Kathy Koshland, our Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Education at UC Berkeley, and the Wood Calvert Professor in the College of Engineering. She's a professor of environmental health sciences in School of Public Health and with the Energy Resources Group. She received a BA in Fine Arts from Haverford College, studied painting in the New York School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture, and received her MS and PhD in mechanical engineering from Stanford. She is one of the 5 here who knows something about integration. So, what I'd like to do is start off actually by asking Irene and Tom to come and help set the stage from the point of view, or points of view, of the National Academies. Thank you.
Come in.
Hello.
Irene, how's it going? My favorite faculty member. How are you? Great to see you. You're so full
really
of
well.
energy, and you're such a skeptic and agitator, but that's another conversation. How are you? Come on in, have a
I'm
seat.
great.
How was Thanksgiving?
Thanksgiving was great. Went with a husband to Texas.
Good.
See the
It's
family.
great to get to know the faculty members.
Yeah.
So how are your kids doing?
Well, I don't have kids, but
Sorry
that's
about
okay.
that. Okay.
That's fine.
Well, look, thanks for stopping by. It's good to see you, and hope you have a good rest of the day
Wait,
now.
Well, actually, I came here for a reason. I
Oh,
wanted to talk to
Jesus.
you about something.
All right.
I know
So
you're
what's on
busy.
your mind? No, that's okay. We got a few minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you sent out a memo last week to the faculty, and we had the
Dean sent a lot of memos, so.
Right. So this one was about the integration memo.
Yes.
Interdisciplinary teaching.
I knew you would love that. You are all into this stuff, I'm sure. So what have
Right.
you started doing with this whole integration
Well,
approach to the curriculum?
okay.
Getting more
So-
students these range of experiences in arts and humanities, as well as your biology. It's so exciting.
Right. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about. So
Can't wait to hear.
So I talked to the faculty, and there are some concerns about how this is going to play out in practice.
First of all, wait, you talked to the faculty behind my back? That's another conversation,
That's
but
my
go
job,
ahead.
But okay. And there's just some concern because, we have to get through our content for the rest of the semester. We have a lot of pressure on us, and, I don't know, we
Okay,
don't know
Look,
if this is going to work
I
out.
know you got to get through your standards and all that stuff, but this is all about the new way of the world in education, about bringing the arts and sciences into the experiences and the humanities, into the experiences of every kid. It's all about the world of the future, and I know you buy into this stuff, right?
Well, but remember, the university is not an integrated entity.
But that's the problem. The university is in all these silos, but the world is not a siloed place. The workplace is not a siloed place.
But the university
That's why we're counting
is.
on you.
Okay.
Look, Irene, I'm counting on you. I'm sick and tired of you always agitating against our stuff. Look, why can't you embrace this idea?
I
I
am
thought,
just telling
look,
you-
you teach biology, right? I'm not a biologist, but look, like, I don't know, cell division. Can't you do like a dance that shows the
Okay.
cell dividing or some kind of photographic display
Sure.
or
So
something?
listen, I've done that before. I've done that as an extra. It was an add-on. I made sure that I had gone through the content for the rest of the semester. But it was something that's nice to have, but it's not something that's necessary. I don't really
Irene,
see
I'm counting
we
on
don't
you.
really see the value added of these integrative approaches.
What are we going to do?
I don't know. I mean, do you really think this is a great investment, a good investment for an already scarce budget?
I mean, the provost said, let's put money and programs together that really integrate these. So I'm all in.
But
Okay?
listen,
I'm all in.
Listen, we could use this money for other stuff, though. Listen, I have a lab with equipment that needs updating. It's an actual safety issue. Like, I need actual new goggles for my student.
Look, What are we going to do about this?
I don't know. Well, how about this? How about we take a vote? How about we take a vote from the people here?
What people here? You and me?
Well, no, the people here in this audience.
What people?
Right here.
Who are these people? And how'd they get into my office? Okay,
What?
I think that's a great idea, actually. So let me ask all of you here. Raise your hand if you think there's a benefit in more effectively integrating opportunities for students to learn the sciences, the arts, the humanities, and I mean biology, chemistry, physics, music, dance, theater, and history and literature, philosophy. Who thinks there's some value in that in preparing students for the future workforce? Okay,
5 people.
it's
There's 5
case
people.
closed.
Don't look behind you. There's 5
everybody raised their hand. Thank you, Irene.
Wait, I'm not done. It's my turn to ask you guys a question. So how many of you, raise your hand if you know, how many of you can point to conclusive scientific evidence that can show whether the integration of arts, humanities, and science in undergraduate and graduate education leads to positive educational outcomes? How many of you can show me conclusive scientific evidence? Raise your hand. Oh, I see one. One hand. You see?
I guess we got a little work to do.
We do. I think
Thank
so.
you all for indulging our little skit here. But in those 3 minutes, we tried to reflect what was in our report, and we're happy to talk more about it in a few minutes.
Gosh, what a strange scene. I have no idea what they're talking about. Okay. Before the rest of the crew joins, I wanted to ask intern Paul, Randy, and Kathy to talk with us first of all about their own personal, maybe professional connection to the integrative issues. Just to do a little scene setting from their respective points of view about why they even showed up tonight. Paul, do you want to come first?
Well, I was scared before I came here, but now after that skit, I'm really scared. But actually, not entirely on purpose, but my personal career as a scientist, the topics that we've explored have been inextricably connected with a way in which it's possible to create a multiplicity of colors, all different kinds of colors. I'll explain that momentarily. And of course, as you know, color provides a dimension by which we can express ourselves creatively, tell stories to each other, and accomplish many other things. So there's a kind of inevitability that the research we would be involved in as scientists would connect in some way or other with those kinds of creative experiences at the university. So I'm going to give some anecdotes about that. First, let me just say that all of you probably will be able to, in your imagination, understand how it is that arises. You've probably at some point, maybe as a very young person, gone to a science museum where you saw you could drop a ball into one of those curved surfaces, and as it moves around towards the hole, the ball moves faster and faster. So in our little research world, we make extremely tiny crystals. They might be 5, 6, 10 atoms across. And it turns out those act like a vessel in which a ball can roll around. In our case, the ball is an electron. And if we make the box smaller, then it moves at a higher speed, just like that ball funneling down. And as a consequence, when it emits light, it will emit a different color. And as a consequence of that, that's a quantum dot, as it's called, that object, that quantum object, can emit a color that we could precisely program. It could be precisely programmed in such a way that it would emit a color that you would perceive as red, green, or blue. And as a consequence, we can make a display out of that. In fact, if you go to the store, you can buy a quantum dot TV that's based on that principle. And the reason that they're interesting is because they can express much more completely the full gamut of colors that your eye is capable of seeing. You may not realize it, but these may seem like they're great displays, but they fall very far short of showing all the colors that your eye can perceive. So ultimately, those kinds of quantum dot displays will enable scientists and artists to express themselves much more completely through the use of color. So about 15 years ago, I had my first experience. I'll relate to you 3 quick experiences where individuals have come into our life in our research group and changed it. About 15 years ago, a Master's of Fine Arts student here at Berkeley named Kate Nichols sent a note one day to me and just said, hey, I've seen that you've got these interesting things on your website where you're making different colors. I'd like to come and be able to take advantage of those colors in the production of my art. And I said, well, you know, we'd love to have you do that, but, you know, it's not so trivial to come in and make these materials to use inside your art. She said, oh, I'm not worried about that. I said, are you sure? Sure enough, she came and actually she spent the next decade, well after she had graduated, learning how to make the materials that we knew how to make in a very precise formulation for the creation of her own artwork. And her presence inside my research group utterly transformed it. It made the students have a different relationship to the world around them that she was there. So much so that another individual, Victor Puntes, who's now a physics professor in Barcelona, while he was there, he started to create a series of artworks in which he took images of the tiny crystals that we make that are produced by electron microscopy, and then lighting them through illumination with colors that could only be produced with this very precise color control. He now has a little gallery in Barcelona, and once a year he puts out a show, and it's a really fun thing to see. He always reports back to us, and Victor's a very interesting person. He always accompanies his new art shows with a series of poems that are accompanied by Spanish guitar. So he's expressed himself in this full range of dimensions, which shows up periodically in these kinds of group meetings for my science research group that are just, you know, they really cause the whole group of students to think, wow, this is a stranger world than I realized. Even very recently, a third person came to us and surprised us a little bit. She's an artist living in Istanbul. She connected with an art restorer who lives in Athens, of all places, and together they cooked up what they thought would make a spectral recipe for creating a color inspired by Yves Klein's blue. Yves Klein, as a painter, had a very beautiful blue color. They wanted to create such a color that would be used in emissive artwork. So instead of being a kind of passive color, it would be one that would be active in the way that a display is. And so they together created a formulation which they call quantum blue, and was entirely theoretical until they came and spent some time in our laboratory, and they subsequently created that color, which is now they're putting into a series of art installations that will be around different places in the world. Each one of those stories has altered the research group in such dramatic ways. And I keep wondering why it isn't, we're not able to create an environment. You know, I would love for us to have created an environment where there are artists in residence inside my research group all the time. You asked us to give one example of how art connects with us, so that's the one example I can give. But I do want to just conclude by saying my own personal experience is that art and science are inextricably intertwined with each other as well. And there are so many dimensions in which those interact with each other. What I've given is an example of translation. In other words, the science has created an ability to express in a new way. But I believe actually there are many much deeper interactions between art and science that this example doesn't fully cover. So I hope during the discussion we can say more about that.
Randy, I think you have slides queued up.
As a professor of computer science, I can't think without PowerPoint, so I do have some slides. And really the theme of the comments that I want to make in response to Shannon's question are some thinking that I've done in the context of, in particular, performance art. So group art, performance, it could be a musical performance. I've actually participated myself in theatrical performances, both as an actor, as a set designer, and as an author. And so understanding that process has really informed a lot of reflection that I've done on the way in which I work with my own graduate students in our research and the kinds of skills I would like to teach to our engineering students. So really, my comments are about what can the performing arts teach an engineering professor, and I have this clip from some improv class to sort of illustrate that. So for me, when I think about the performing arts, I'm thinking about a group production. Lots of different skills that are brought to the table in order to make that production successful. There's, of course, the artists, but the way in which the artists are supported by lighting and set design and staging under the sort of mentorship in some sense of the director. The director can be a dictator, or the director can be an amazing facilitator and mentor to the elements, the individuals who are participating in the production. So when I think about my own personal experiences of participating in a performance, I really think of the power of the ensemble, how each individual contributes something that they know how to do, and that you don't have a successful performance if one individual is fantastic and everyone else doesn't come along, doesn't support that. I have an experience of participating in a performance where it was one of those moments where my mind started to wander while I'm on the stage, and I actually jumped ahead in the script several pages. And it's kind of like the show must go on, right? So one of the other actors who was participating with me in that performance understood what I was doing, supported me by rolling the dialogue back to where we were supposed to be. And then we sort of picked up and went forward and of course repeated some of the dialogue, but I don't think the audience noticed that at all. And that idea of how we sort of are watching for each other, supporting each other, is such an important element of when you think about group research or group project in a class or something like that. So to me, the sort of shared creative process, we're all in it together, we all contribute as we can, we all gain benefit and excitement from the work that we do together. The kind of personal bonds that come from this kind of shared experience are sort of very emotionally an amazing experience to have, right? So it really gets at the heart of what the kind of teamwork you would like to have in almost any field of human endeavor, whether it's business work or research or hopefully things that our students are learning in the classroom and in the laboratory. And so that notion of a production is so important. And that's, the engineering perspective on this is we'd like to bring to bear interdisciplinary teams where each individual can contribute the skill set that they have to the level of skill, the level of expertise that they have, so the group together is high performing and can advance on the issues that they're addressing, and everyone contributes as best they can to the successful project. They often say there are no winners on a losing team and no losers on a winning team, and so it really is a sort of group endeavor in terms of the most successful engineering type projects. So when you look across what engineers do and what sort of performance artists do and the entire production team associated with them, it's about teamwork, it's about mutual support, it's about acceptance. After my performance where I completely blew my dialogue, no one came up to me and started beating me up. We were all, oh, we made it through. No one noticed, it was fantastic. They're all applauding at the end. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So again, this sort of group-driven creative process, the way in which, even during those rehearsals and so on, that the interaction with the director and the other sort of elements of the production, the way we work together in order to create a shared product was so important, and again, is a learning experience also for engineering teams. Now, one of the things that I was able to, I guess I'm not quite on the right slide there, sorry. One of the things I did during a sabbatical in 2016 was to take a course for teachers at the American Conservatory Theater called Back to the Source. And I have to admit I was the only university teacher who was there. Everyone else was a high school teacher. But it was a very wonderful experience in terms of going through in a week what a performing artist would learn in drama school, in many years in terms of understanding speech and how to use your voice as an instrument, which is so important, improvisation, physical comedy, movement, working as teams. There were so many really intriguing and fun aspects to how we spent that week, but I found it very interesting that at the end of the week, the course was organized so that there would be a shared creative endeavor involving all of the participants. The group of us broke up into groups of 5 people, and we put together a rap, which was set to music and then performed for our loved ones, so it was at least a very friendly audience. Now, my own experience, I have served in a variety of productions. There's at least one person in the audience who will resonate with some of these photographs. This was a production called Gaijin, where it was a story of modern or really industrializing Japan, and I was one of the modern samurai. There was another team of samurai who were more traditionalists. I did write a stage review based on the characters of George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman series, and this is a screenshot from that. Flashy is in the middle of that. And then one of the high points of my acting career was to play the role of Nobel laureate I.I. Rabi in a production of In the Matter of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which of course touches Berkeley very deeply. And so that was a tremendous amount of fun to recreate that important historical scientific character in the context of a performance. But as I said, really in terms of how we teach engineering and how we do engineering, it's really all about projects. And unfortunately, in our classes, the next couple of slides capture a lot of what winds up happening in classes. What a group project is supposed to teach you about is communication, responsibility, collaboration, and teamwork, when in fact, what it teaches you is to trust no one, which of course is the exact opposite of a sort of production performance experience. And in the real world, it's not about trusting no one, it's about supporting each other. And so how we can integrate some of these sort of insights from the performance arts world into the way in which we organize course projects would be fantastic. So I just want to end with a quote. My own research area, probably the one home run in my research history, is the development of a high-performance, reliable storage system called RAID. It's probably not well known that the disk drive, the magnetic disk drive that is, these days not in our laptops, but used to be, was developed at Berkeley by a colleague of mine, Paul Morton, who was on the faculty in the 50s, 60s, and retired in the 70s, and was very active as an emeritus faculty member in the early days of my years as a faculty member at Berkeley in the 80s and 90s. And this is a quote about a project he did. The project was important in contribution to the evolution of computer design, but was even more so in its education of a generation of master's and doctoral students who were to become leaders in the rapidly growing computer industry. And all too often we forget that it isn't the research artifact that is the real product of our research projects, but it's the students and the people who've been involved in it and how they have been transformed by that experience and go out into the world and do wonderful things. And really it was about the fantastic people and the team work that they learned on that project as they went forward and actually created the storage industry in California and in the world. So this is the place where I think performance arts and engineering come so closely together in terms of how we create this shared experience, teamwork, and shared sense of purpose in our, both in our classes and in our research projects. And with that, I'll hand over to Kathy.
Okay, we'll help Kathy close out this opening gambit.
Thanks. So, I want to say a few thoughts on the arts and engineering, so following Randy, although I think broadly about this. Most of the, in fact, all the artwork you see here is artwork I produced in my undergraduate and postgraduate years, early into some of my scientific work, and there's been a lull in between. I'm trying to get back to it, so I can't admit to being as active in this area as I would like at the moment. But three key things that I want to talk about. One is, in the evolution of the academy, there was a real negativity about, in some ways, the practical arts. So the notion of the study of language or history or mathematics was accepted, but the idea that you would have even engineering, let alone in some cases certain parts of the performance arts, as part of the academy was seen somewhat negatively. And if you think about our own evolution as an institution, those of us that are faculty know that there was a long time in which folks had a very hard time understanding how to promote someone whose work was a set of paintings or a theatrical performance or a musical composition, or for that matter, a computer program. That the making of work was not something that was necessarily understood or appreciated. So I will say a little bit more about that in a minute. The second thing I want to talk about is what it means to, be an artist or to be a researcher. And there's a combination where you're alone, you're working on a project yourself. There's almost a mythological aspect of this, that you're only supposed to do this. But in fact, there's a really important part of together, which both Andy and Paul pointed to, but in the studio world, in the art world, the role of the critique, when done properly, is about together. It's going to the point that Randy said about being supportive of each other. It's a way of expanding. It's a way of exploring your ideas. It's not dissimilar to presenting a set of ideas, say in a Gordon conference if you're in the sciences, where you're allowed to come in with sort of half-baked ideas and get feedback. Well, that's what critiques are often, not about the final product. It's about your journey along the way and how you interact and collaborate with that. And finally, then, I want to talk a little bit about what it was like to go from being a painter to being an experimentalist doing combustion and air pollution research. So one of the things I wanted to say about engineering and the arts is an essential piece is the making of work. And to do that, you have to be engaged in a process of discovery. And however that evolves, when you, in my case, you're looking at a blank canvas, you set up whatever you're trying to reinterpret and imagine, and you're not totally sure how it's going to go. This painting is actually a chestnut blossom that in reality is about 2 inches high. And this painting is actually about, those of you who've been in my office, it's in my office, and it's about a 4-foot square painting. So I've blown up that little tiny and interpreted it in a particular way. And the role of color, I was loved what Randy said earlier, what Paul said earlier about color, because the exploration you could do in this little tiny flower was just amazing to kind of imagine what it was when you blew it up. So it involved, in this case, a very intimate set of observations. The skill that you gain from looking is amazing. And it's actually something you have to practice. It is not something that is necessarily intuitive, even if you have a lot of talent. I have a brother who's way more talented than I am in this space, but you still have to work at it, even if you have some innate talent. So you're working with the medium, you're working with whatever your object is, and then, you have a dialogue with the painting as you're creating it, but then others who get involved have a dialogue with that work that may be completely different than what your experience with the painting is. So that understanding of your audience doesn't necessarily mean you're painting for them, but you have to recognize that their interpretation, their response to it may be very different than your own, and that's fine. That's part of what is so fantastic about the arts, is it can speak to each of us in different kinds of ways. So this is a painting that I did at the New York Studio School, and that was a rough place. I spent a year there. Mercedes Matter, who was the director, kept waiting for me to have some sort of emotional breakthrough. That's not what I was going to do. The engineer in me actually shows up, I think, in this painting very well, even though I hadn't a clue about engineering at the time that I was doing this. But it was also a place where the critique really became an important element, and working with both my colleagues, my peers, sharing a studio with someone, and then having this opportunity to have a dialogue around the work. And this was one painting that I got a lot of positive feedback from outside folks about it. This next painting is actually very personal. This is one, if you'll note on the right, you'll notice the patternelle. That, of course, is what Georgia O'Keeffe painted many, many times. I spent a summer on the Ghost Ranch when I was in college and met her, and got to sort of see the landscape when she was in. I can identify places on the ranch that she worked on. So had a very personal meaning. That's a self-portrait in the middle. And then a series of objects that meant something to me. I have a doll collection. I love Vermeer. I mean, there were things in that painting. The vase is one that I actually made as a high school student in France. So there were elements in there. This is a very intimate, personal painting that I still really like. And then finally, the painter and the experimentalist. This is, for me, the evolution. I ended up in painting because I started out studying history and art history and religion and anthropology and you name it. I was all over the map. And in all those cases, I was frustrated because I wanted to understand the process of something happening. And I evolved into working as an artist because I wanted to understand what it meant to make something. And I couldn't write about something until I understood the process by which it evolved. And so that framed what I did there. Then I went off and after I finished in New York Studio School, I went off and ended up in Washington working for a forerunner of the energy, the Department of Energy, and got involved in engineering, thought I'll do policy work. And so I ended up moving to Stanford when my husband got into law school and met with people there, and I sort of decided, do I want to continue studying art or shall I try engineering? And I thought, why not? I'll just try it. And I'm also somebody who did not like math or science. I had avoided math or science since I closed my physics book in high school. So there was a 7-year gap. So I took 2 years of undergraduate courses in science, but at that point in my life, I knew why I was studying it. I was intrigued by it. And after a master's year, when I was sort of going back and forth, do I want to just stay with policy and master's, decided I would go on and get a PhD in an experimental field because I had to understand how things worked. And that's really what drove me into that process. So it's, I want to just close by saying that engineering and technology provide approaches. I love the fact that there was a way to kind of dive into a problem and begin to really solve it. But it's only going to be successful if those of us who practice in those fields have a deep understanding about human beings, about culture, about what drives individuals, about listening. A lot of my research here at Berkeley has been trying to understand what communities really want when we actually suggest to them that they use a particular kind of technology to solve a particular problem. But if they don't really want that, if that's not really the problem they're trying to solve at the moment, we will make no headway. And it's that listening element is so critical, that observation element is so critical if we're going to be successful. So liberal education integrates the arts and humanities and STEM. It's essential to our collective work. I argue actually in a chapter I wrote in a book that engineering is a liberal art and ought to be conceived that way. So I'll end with that.
Feeling, is it on? Is it on? I had a feeling that asking them to start with a personal story would be a pretty good idea, but I didn't know it was going to be that good. Can we just thank this incredible group right off the bat? All right, so I already anticipated, and it has already come up, some of what we're trying to do at Berkeley and some of the themes that we heard, and perhaps some of you have had a chance to read the incredibly lengthy report, about what it means to integrate, to think about relationships amongst these different disciplines, to work conceptually and also operationally in order to create experiences like we heard. So the moniker that we are giving in many ways right now, thanks to Paul's initial work when he was Vice Chancellor of Research and now carried forward by so many people here in this room and on the stage, is the language of discovery, thinking about the role of research in undergraduate education, but also realizing that research at the university takes many forms and produces and takes shape in many different kinds of formats. The realization that it might take shape in paintings, in curated exhibition, in documentary film, in product design, in architectural plans, etc. And so part of what we're trying to surface is, at Berkeley, the ecology that produces the kind of integrative experiences we saw here and we see thematized in the report. But it's hard work. You have office hours, like we saw dramatized earlier. And also, I think different ways of thinking of, I think that when we talk about discovery or when we even talk about the arts, we already saw here different ideas about what the arts do. The apprehension of color is perhaps slightly different than the community building activity of the ensemble, which might be slightly different still from the synergy that, Kathy was isolating. And so how we think about integration in a way that tracks all of the different relationships that so-called creative fields might have with so-called, I won't say it, surfacing the collaborative creativity across all of these disciplines means different things. So just from the perspective of Berkeley, I'm wondering how this team thinks about how Berkeley could be a place of experimentation for a report like we saw with NASEM, especially around discovery, and what you all feel like you learned or were provoked by as we think about discovery here at Berkeley. Anybody want to start first?
Well, I'll just say I love the idea that Paul raised about embedding very different kinds of participants in one's laboratory or vice versa in one's studio. That there was a wonderful performance, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago that Marty Jenkins, who's a major choreographer here in the Bay Area, organized, which was called Fault. Some of you may remember this. And Fault took on multiple meanings. So the faculty with whom she worked were in civil and environmental engineering, the seismologists, in earth and planetary studies. There were the earthquake engineers in CEE. There were the psychologists, because obviously Fault sits there, religion and philosophy. So there was that notion that you take a concept and work, again, collaboratively across the disciplines, and then the idea of embedding someone in your lab, in this case, to learn a technique. But I think we don't think, that to me, we should think more expansively about how we integrate in what we do.
Yeah, if my perspective on this is, you saw the little slide about what you learn is to trust no one, of how to create these experiences outside of the classroom, outside of the environment where you're sort of have to worry about being graded for it. When you walk around the campus, walk by the Hearst Pavilion on a weekend night and see all the kids who are doing these synchronized choreography things for fun, and just the amazing creativity and sort of group engagement and high energy and all the things that are going on, it's kind of like, how do we it's clear that there's huge amount of opportunity for tapping into the energy of our students who want to put time and want to put thinking into doing these kinds of things. But when you put them in a classroom and you have to assign an A or B or C, it changes the nature of that experience dramatically. So how to provide kind of like a structure where there's also a learning outcome, maybe it doesn't need to get a grade, but there's a little bit of structure to what's going on, yet can tap into this really tremendous vein of creativity and energy that our students have. I think is a bit of a challenge. How do we organize ourselves to provide a framework, a context for channeling that invention, that creativity, and so on, without calling it a course somehow? I think is really important.
Yeah, I think we've had a really interesting discussion over the past quite a few years now, and I think, Kathy's been instrumental, and Randy, in having that discussion, many people all around the campus. But, we certify education through degree programs, right? And they have formal aspects to them and so on. And they're vital to our future, and they're vital for the people who are getting that certification. So, but I mean, the reality is we've had a really, I think, interesting dialogue, really provocative discussion around this concept of discovery experiences, which are really intended to have more thoughtful plan for how we can imagine what we want the attributes of a person who leaves Berkeley and goes out into the world. What do we want them to carry with them? How do we want them to go out into the world? And we've recently been using this language of connect, discover, engage, and reflect. And that language is around saying, well, we would love the attributes to be that connect, or that people are used to forming these kinds of communities that Randy was talking about, which are supportive of each other. And in the discover language, that we want people who are really having the experience of trying to do something in which they see themselves as the expert. Not that they're being talked at by an expert, but they are themselves having agency and trying to make it work despite all the struggles that we each experience along the way. And engage, I mean, that is part of the Berkeley ethos, is to challenge the world to be a better place. So we certainly want them to take that into it. And finally, the piece of reflect. And so that now, I think we're really now talking about that. Those are attributes we'd like people to take away, but we'd also like to think about how each one of those words can show up in each person's time while they're here as an undergraduate, and to be more conscious that that's going to take place in dimensions outside the classroom. And we have to plan the classroom activity and this other aspect to be able to reinforce and support each other. And so I think we've had a really interesting discussion, but now it's up to us to actually figure out if we're going to make that all really happen at the scale that we wanted to. And that's what I find to be a fascinating topic that's very motivating to me at this moment.
I'll move on, but I do want to hear from Tom and Irene, especially as you've been circulating this report, what you think Berkeley could learn, or what warning signs or inspirations or challenges you might give us. One other important topic for many who often come to these gatherings or also help us in the A+D Council was something that relates to, I think, Paul's point when he was talking about Kate Nichols. When you were talking about Kate Nichols in the lab, you were talking about not only how she learned how to use the materials and had developed this painting practice, but also how it transformed your research lab, which was a great story of reciprocity. One difficult topic sometimes, or a challenging topic for some, say, so-called creatives or artists, is often that they feel that they're brought to the research lab sort of late in the game, positioned more as the communication platform or PR platform for scientific discovery, and not, which is fine, which is a fine role, but not the only role. And I just wondered about that dynamic, because I was really struck that you really emphasized the two-way street there.
Well, there's something I'd like to say about that, just again, personally as a scientist, which is related to things that Kathy touched upon as well, when she was talking about taking her little blossom and then blowing it up to large size and so on. So I do think in our little research world, we're talking about the arrangements of atoms in space and learning how to, in your mind's eye, visualize those. And frankly, some of the best people at this business see beauty in those arrangements. And they think about how they could be arranged in different ways, and how the actual aesthetic sense that somebody gets from the visual arts, the principles of how to think about how things are arranged in space and how those reflect in our mind, those actually do show up very directly in the science itself. And Kate was involved in a lot of interesting discussions with us about those kinds of topics. So when I say that it was enriching, it wasn't just enriching in the sense that people thought, oh, isn't that cool, somebody finds that appealing. But it was actually in these other ways that I'm talking about. And so I do think that how we create new things in the sciences is actually really deeply, not just occasionally related, but actually really deeply related in how people actually make discoveries in science itself. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And I don't think we do enough to bring that out in our real practice in each, of these worlds, yeah.
One of the things that I had the pleasure about 15 years ago to be a fellow in the Townsend Center for a semester, actually for a year. And that experience was really valuable because the Townsend, for those of you who don't know, the Townsend Center on the campus is the Center for the Humanities. And most of the faculty and graduate students were in departments like English and literature and rhetoric. And it was really revelatory and incredibly helpful to me subsequently with students in particularly the Energy and Resources group to understand how much of the creative work was done in the writing. Because as a scientist, you just write it up, and you might have a few arguments and work through some of it. It actually made my own writing in science much better because I began to realize I wanted to examine things in a different way and to work through it. But to understand that creative process in a very different way and see how the conversations we would have when someone would present, read a chapter, it changed how I gave a talk at Princeton. I gave a talk at Princeton in mechanical engineering with no PowerPoint and talked about it. And you could have heard a pin drop in the room the entire time because they had to listen because there was nothing to look at. So, it's interesting to sort of take away and do some things differently as a consequence of that interaction with different fields and come away with, it maybe help a whole lot of students be able to really work through their dissertation process very differently than I had before I'd had that experience.
Maybe I'll just ask one more question before opening it also to Q&A. But one topic that I think we saw thematized in Irene and Tom's skit has to do with, there's a few themes we could actually isolate from their skit. How hard this is to do. How hard it is. So we could talk on the general topic of how hard this is to do operationally. I think about the incredible leadership that Kathy, Paul, Randy are providing. It still is it's an incredible effort in order to source and mine and frame and reframe all that goes on here and put it in a different kind of package. So there's that. Next to also, what did we see in Irene? Faculty resistance. I don't know. Sometimes faculty resistance or deanly resistance. But the difficulty of finding time to do integration, whether it's in your classroom or in your research. Are there things about how we evaluate the faculty output, how we value faculty research, how we value workload measures as educators, how we value syllabi and course requirements, et cetera? The rubber sort of hits the road in those areas. At Berkeley, we have worked to try to really foreground the role of creative accomplishment in faculty members' portfolio, and to put it on the same level as published scholarship, and also to notice that there are peer-reviewed appropriate professional norms for evaluating that. So we have tried to accomplish things that way. That said, the integration work takes time. Are you really going to be rewarded institutionally beyond the pat in the back and office hours? So I wonder if we could talk about some of that, the operational stuff, and some of these, some of the more difficult issues of implementation.
Well, that's the purpose of our little skit here is, we're true believers in this idea. And we truly believe, and in fact are so impressed by some of the things going on here. Irene and I have spent only half a day here. We got a great tour of several of your facilities. This is really the manifestation of the report in many ways, the cool stuff that's happening here. we've been to different campuses, and sometimes I'll ask the question, what would happen if instead of asking students when they arrived on campus, what would you like to major in, we asked them, what problems would you like to solve? And then build a set of experiences around that. It sounds like you're doing that in many cases for your students. But my question then back to you all is, A, how do you find the time to do it as faculty members, as provosts, as deans? And then secondly, how do you overcome the faculty resistance, especially when I would imagine you are making inroads, but it still must be tough to incentivize and reward faculty for doing this when research publications and other things like that are what gets rewarded. So it's hard work. We think it's the right thing to do, others may not, but if it is the right thing to do, then how do you build a system of incentives on this campus and every campus in the country that really encourages faculty to take that step? It's a tough challenge.
There are a lot of meetings about this one. Perhaps.
Yeah, look, I mean, that's a really hard question, as you know. I want to say that there are examples of where we really engage in understanding what our colleagues are doing as part of evaluation that we take very seriously. I do believe that when we're looking, for example, at the research activities of a faculty member, it's not our practice to default on some what I think are rather not very helpful kind of numerical but easy at hand measures that might be ones that are citations or these indices that are created and things like that. People actually read the work and they think about it and they engage with it and they try to exercise their best judgment around it. And I mean, I think it's really true that some of the currency or some of the resource allocation processes in the campus are really tied to, ways in which we can, things that we can actually measure that are, that are really volume measures rather than quality measures in some sense. And so it's incumbent on us to have, if we want to make this vision occur, that we're able to actually also have a dimension of our evaluation of faculty that engages with their ideas around this in a way that is thoughtful for each person. And I doubt we're going to be able to make a simple metric that just says, well, this person is enabling discovery and here's the discovery index. It's not likely to work that way. And so I think it is rather in a similar way where we have to engage with that person's ideas and what they have described as what they want to do. And I think that our group of folks that are involved in all those kinds of things are very attuned to that. That's what they like and prefer. So I don't think it's anti-resonant with our culture to be able to do it, but it's not easy to just say, well, here's a measure. I just don't think that's going to be easy to do. And if we try and do that, we'll probably create something that people will be able to game, and it won't mean very much. And so on.
I think one of the things that's been interesting here has been the transformation in the conversation around teaching and the engagement with students and seeing students as undergraduates as ones who can co-create with us. When I look at the work we've done over the last decade or so with our support for faculty, it's no longer that horrible line in your promotion papers that say you need help with teaching, go to what was called then the Center for Educational Development. We now have what we call the Academic Innovation Studio. We have a regular series of engagement for faculty. It was showcased tonight around the Adobe Creative Fellows. There's a lot more peer support for teaching, a lot more open dialogue about what we're doing across all the disciplines. I think in some ways we've broken certain norms and created a more open environment for a real engagement around pedagogy, around its study, around understanding how it works, what its outcomes are. I'm not sure we're still yet rewarding it quite the way we should, as to Paul's point, but I think there's a lot of groundwork that's been laid to allow it to blossom in a way that I don't think would have been possible on this campus well, probably 15 years ago. I think it's a very different landscape for everyone.
Just to be very brief, I think I'm a complete believer in enlightened self-interest, and as a faculty member, there is a kind of spirit that you want to have in your research group, which is creative, collaborative, and so on, and then you feel that you have to bring that into the way in which you approach instruction as well, because you are teaching the next generation of graduate students that are the next generation of research collaborators and so on. So if you really believe or you stop and think and reflect on how do I create a collaborative, creative environment in my research group, you will be committed to thinking about how you get that into your courses and how you contribute to curriculum. And, I do think that when it comes to a lot of these creative activities, they transcend our standard curriculum, that we need to create experiences for our students outside of the classroom, because it's so difficult in the context of you need to learn this stuff in order to get that certification that you know it. Can we come up with these sort of cross-cutting opportunities for our students to learn about these dimensions of creativity, teamwork, collaboration, and so on? And I think we can and we need to, because at the end of the day, this is the pipeline of the kind of talent that will go into the sort of teams that, whether it's in the university research or in industry and so on, this is exactly the kind of skill set that people are kind of crying out for amongst our young people.
Well, that also does relate to a last question that I'll just let hang in the air, that we often hear an older argument that worries that the arts are largely an ornament, largely about a hobby, largely something on the side, and that your real job will not, that getting a real job is not entail involving those skills. But it is sort of interesting how much the discourse of work, or the future of work, does seem, perhaps for good and for bad, a different kind of discourse that validates this kind of integration. And that was a big theme in the report. So whether it's around equity issues or around career-centered issues, it really is a pivot to focus on this as a solution for careers rather than a distraction from getting a job. All right. We have a number of fabulous people, actually, from different walks of the campus and different community members and students. I wonder if we have questions from the audience, or also amplifications you want to do from your wing. Oh, that's here. We're going to try to get a microphone to people, because we are also recording, and it's a big theater. Thank you. And you can put the microphone to the next question up there.
I think one thing that was left out that could be mentioned is how wonderful our freshman and sophomore seminar program is in making the kinds of connections that you're talking, especially the Great Ideas course also, that bring in faculty specifically from different disciplines to teach groups of students in cross-disciplinary areas. And especially in the freshman program, it sort of gets to Tom Rudin's point that the students pick those freshman seminars based on, hey, I'm interested in this topic, or this is a problem I want to solve, or this is an area I'm interested in. They haven't picked a major yet. They don't know what they're doing. And in my own experience with my freshman seminar, which is about evolution, we talk about history in the social context in which Darwin and Wallace were found, and we talk about evolution of the brain, so we bring in Kahneman's work in psychology and Paul Bloom at Yale, and we show videos, Inherit the Wind, and talk about poetic license in relating history, and then we watch Judgment Day, Intelligent Design on Trial, and Nova Video talks about how documentaries get made. So in the context of that freshman seminar, where the main topic is the science of evolution, and we get to DNA sequencing and genomics eventually, we cover an awful lot of ground that connects it to other aspects of the campus, and I have students from lots of departments, not just my own, in that or they're headed to be in other departments, business and other things in that seminar. So I think the campus should be proud that we have that freshman and seminar and Great Ideas program, because I think they directly address this issue.
Buckets like that, yeah.
Well, so I just want to say on that, I thank you, Jeremy. That's really true. they're jewels. But one practice I've been learning about, one of the wonderful things that happens at Berkeley, of course, as you know, is people just go off and do stuff, and everywhere you can look. And so there's many things that people are trying all the time, and so we can try through some kind of evolution to find the better ways. And so one thing that has been coming out recently is that some subset of those kinds of seminars have integrated inside them a piece that talks to the students explicitly about what's the next step for them on a discovery experience. And it tries to tell them where resources are available and to tell them how they can find pathways that will be encouraging ones for them, where they will not, so that they will not be taking this incredible energy and then just finding that they don't know how in this really this huge university with so many opportunities. You'd be surprised that maybe none of us are surprised, but very often students are finding that they don't know and they can't find the way to take the next step. So that's one thing I've taken away, is that, and that we would like to have those be connect classes, in the sense that not only do they get inspired, but also they see where to go next.
Great, thank you. I think we have a microphone there, and then we'll bring one down here. Tony? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So this conversation has been very oriented around how the arts in the form of works or aesthetics, like music, visual, or performing arts, can kind of inform scientific work. And I am wondering about the role of the humanities, particularly in relation to humanities research and theory in STEMs. And I'm thinking, for example, of how experiment design and interpretation of results could change in productive ways to address social structures, like structural inequalities, for example. And Kathy Koshland started to bring this up toward the end of her introduction in relation to listening to what populations want. But I'd love to hear more from the other panelists on this and how you've thought about addressing this.
Can I just say a little something first about the topic? Because Tom and I were talking earlier, and I'm just to be, we're all in this in partnership. He said, so what do you not like about the report? He said, and first of all, one thing I would just say, because it's not just this report, but it's in general some of the efforts that sometimes some of the sort of STEM engaging with non-STEM fields, there can be a kind of homogenization of all of the arts and of all of the humanistic fields. I mean, the arts are different from each other, and the humanities are different from each other, and so first of all, I just want to say I really appreciate that foregrounding. Just as artists and humanists might also homogenize STEM, that part of what has to happen is that the abstract conversation has to happen for some levels, but there needs to be a recognition of heterogeneity in there. But it seemed like second step is really perhaps around interpretation, or around a different kind of shared sensibility in terms of questioning assumptions and critique that might sometimes be part of, say, a conceptual art practice, but isn't certainly owned by art, and in some ways so much of the wheelhouse of the humanist. So anyway, I want to thank you for the question, just acknowledge that risk here.
Let me just say very briefly, from the way we looked at that, it's a great question. I mean, it has to do with the fact that science and engineering and technology enable us to manipulate the world around us in ways that hopefully will benefit us. But it's the humanities that can help inform the kind of world we want to live in and how we should manipulate the world around us. I mean, look at this whole gene editing and the headlines from China this past week. We know what the science gives us the opportunity to create, good and bad, but I think it's going to be up to the humanists in all of us and the humanists among you who really understand history and literature and philosophy to guide us on the best use of that science. That's how we at the macro level have been looking at this issue.
I'll just jump in. I also appreciate the question and the comment. I think there are a couple places that are models on this campus for some of this. One is the American Cultures Engaged Scholarship work, which often incorporates artistic expression and the use of art making of different kinds of work and presentation as part of the way in which you illuminate the issues for a community, the way in which you define what the problems are and how they're expressed. So that's one area where we've made a fairly significant investment and have pulled together different dimensions. And the reason I say this as a beginning is there's also a component now with the data science initiative that's really powerful within those sets of works where you're bringing together all of those dimensions in the ACES program. So that's one example. I think that Shannon said earlier that so often the arts seem to be a nice to have. And I think part of what I'd like to disrupt is the notion that notion exactly, that rather it's actually an incredibly important part of how we express what is happening, how we respond to things. Sometimes it's about giving us a contemplative experience and a relief from what we're dealing with. Other times it is the very expression of what it is that we're trying to address and deal with. And so it was interesting, I was talking to a colleague who was saying he was bringing history into his course, and half the class, it's a physics class, half the class was loving what he was doing, and the other half was just like, I just need the equation, just don't bother me with any of this. And that context was so important, and he just said, I'm just going to keep doing it because it's more important to, even though this set of students don't like it, I'm going to do it in spite of that because there's a half that does and they actually need it.
As a computer scientist, of course, the field has been really faced with its ethical dilemma in terms of how the technology we have been creating can be used. If you think of there is almost an optimistic view that infuses a lot of engineering and technological work of course we're going to create a universe where you will have all the information you need at your fingertips, and will anticipate the information that you need, and we're going to make life so easy for everyone, because that's kind of what we aspire to. This is what I would like to have. And then you don't really have a context for describing or thinking about how that can be used in a negative way. So is the information being provided to me and shaped, is it really what I want? Or is it what is saleable, or how money is made, or what is the ethical context for this increasingly automated world that we live in, that is providing us with information that we now have a better understanding can be shaped by factors which are not simply about what it is I want, but economics and the sort of the business model and even nefarious propaganda efforts and things of that nature. So there needs to be a much broader engagement, I think, with people who think about the big humanistic picture. And this is an essential thing to get into the way in which we think about the education of our technologists and scientists. I just gave you an example that comes from the technological world, the scientific world, the way that we can think about genetic genome engineering around food, around animals, around people, leads to all kinds of ethical considerations in the way in which we can reshape the world around us. We may think of it in a positive sense and in improving, which is something that is the scientific philosophical mindset. When we are fully aware, we should be more aware of the way in which these things can be warped and used for nefarious purposes. So how do we get that dialogue going so that we have a more complete picture of how we are hopefully advancing, the scientific frontier. It's an opportunity for a tremendous amount of, very positive engagement, I believe, and Berkeley is well positioned as being excellent so broadly across the disciplines to really try and tackle this.
I just want to jump in and say I thought that the skit, I really enjoyed. I was frightened by your skit because it captured so many aspects of all kinds of things. But if there may be one thing that we heard from that skit is how much it's important to be listening all the time. And so I think the humanities are going to be very central to all aspects of what our society is like in the future and to what they're fundamental to what is at the core of a great university. So I think it's really, I mean, when you said, do we have avenues for the human, I'd like to be listening more to hear from the humanists about what they see as how their life of exploration, how it intersects with the topics that we've talked about. I think we need to listen and hear that pretty carefully before, I rather than be the scientist opining on it at this moment. Maybe that's one thing I took away from your very excellent skit.
Well, and actually, I think our next question is coming from the Dean of the Arts and Humanities, who has a microphone. So, Tony,
This
jump
is
in.
working?
Yes,
It is.
And do we have another question afterward? Okay, we'll
So
get a
this is
microphone there.
really stimulating discussion, and so many wonderful things have been said, and I especially appreciate this last round of questioning. In some ways, unbeknownst to me, it some ways set up the question I want to ask, and it's about the relationship between science and its past and its history, and the relationship between the arts and their history. And my sense is that the relationship between, say, music and its past, the visual arts and their past, literature and its past is very different from the relationship between science and its past. They're not wholly unrelated, but they are, in terms of the practice of so many of our disciplines, the engagement with the past is a very different thing. So to cut as rapidly to the chase as possible, my question is, what might motivate a scientist or an engineer to participate in a graduate seminar or a seminar of any kind on Wordsworth, Dante, Delacroix, Beethoven, I
But
Ching?
especially the past.
But
past.
these
Just
things
thinking
that
about
are
the-
from the past, and that for humanists are very much alive with us now, and are the things that we are concerned about so very deeply. And what I hear is that it's relatively easy, relative being the important term, to get the humanist to visit the science lab, but very difficult to get a scientist to visit the humanities graduate seminar.
Wonderful. Who wants to take it up? Yeah, this notion of the past being having a different shape in one's imagination. I mean, the past is continually excavated and re-excavated from a humanities perspective. I mean, and you know,
And not as often. And there's an interesting history around is it cellulosic chemistry that kind of was a lot of work done in the 20s and 30s, and then it kind of disappeared. So there's almost a funny thing in science where I think the antecedents are often forgotten because the next shiny new object comes forward and everybody focuses. Am I being fair?
No, totally. I mean, I was just going to say, the notion that somehow in the world of science you forget, but I mean, it's fascinating to me because I don't really think it's quite accurate. And, one thing that I will often tell my coworkers as they're trying to launch themselves off on their next stage is that a very fertile thing they could do is go back and try to find some part of the scientific literature that's 50 years old or so, because they'll find inside there grappling with things, with concepts that at the time all the tools weren't there, and yet when those are renewed, they'll find great productivity because buried inside those older works are so I'm not so sure that it's the case that those things are so divorced from each other, but I do see what you're saying, and just to put one other thing on that, Tony, one dimension that we don't explore enough. For example, today we now have technologies that allow us to take a book that's 500 years old and never open it, but read every single page, right? And the scientists who are involved in projects like that invariably fall in love with what's written on those pages and end up working very closely with their colleagues. So I do think there are many ways into this, that are there. But your point about, will we get scientists to come to, one of the seminars on a historical figure? It does happen quite often. I know that there's a number of colleagues who end up doing that later in their life because that's when they feel they have time more for it. Perhaps that's a loss, and we need to think harder about how we could make those opportunities greater. But everyone does feel, of course, this crazy world of increasing time pressure and emails and junk that prevents them from doing what's really important.
Maybe even changing curriculum and major requirements. Hard stuff. Oh no. I think we had one more question on this side. Is that right? Or do we have? Oh, sorry, there. Okay, perhaps. Okay, there.
Yeah. So part of this discussion, you communicated, how can we support, motivate, and reward faculty? But do you think that maybe we should also take a step back and look for a longer term solution with respect to graduate students? Because a lot of us are coming right out of undergrad into grad school and are thrown into a classroom and told to teach with no formal experience. And so what efforts are being made to maybe support grad students in becoming teachers and maybe formalize the process so we get exposure and practice in integrating these different concepts that you guys are talking about? Because we have an army of graduate students, some of which are going to become future faculty.
Can I take that one? Because in my department, we have a course for teaching assistants, and you are not permitted to teach a course without taking this particular course. I mean, there are many teaching assistants who take it concurrently, but you're supposed to take it in advance of actually being put in front of a class. And I can tell you that, and I've taught that class quite a few times, and in teaching that class, I actually drew on some of the experience I had in that Back to the Source American Conservatory Theater class that I took. We have exercises to build confidence in projecting to a classroom. So there's a set of aspects of performance art that are very useful as a skill to address a gigantic room full of students. There are elements of how to put together, sort of teaching assistant exercises, which are collaborative, improv type things that you can do, even in teaching computer networking or something like that. And so there are a set of skills that can be communicated to our, sort of novice teaching assistants, which are about managing the classroom, making things interesting. I have to say that the little skit that the session began with was such a beautiful example of how to communicate a lot of information in a non-standard way that's very different from a set of PowerPoint points about the report. I mean, that's really what they were after in that, but it electrified us, right? We were watching it very closely, enjoying it, not knowing where it was going to go compared to how they could have summarized the report on, the report on 3 slides. And so you actually can try and teach some of that to teaching assistants, and they do, kind of creative things in the context of the discipline that they're trying to teach, which are beyond the PowerPoint kind of approach to it. So, I know that course is technically, that kind of course is technically required across the campus. It may be done in a more creative fashion in some corners than in other corners of the campus, but there's an opportunity to do it.
And yeah, as John was just saying, if changing that pedagogy course that's in
Let's
each
take it
department
over.
would be,
Take over that course.
would be great.
But one thing just to mention that, because I think your question is really very, very important, and also very, very frequently graduate students are mentors to undergraduates, and I think we could be. I would like to see us having a version of events where we helped those graduate students who wanted to be involved in those things to also, as they gain more experience doing it, to have a systematic approach to helping students learn how to become mentors, and also eventually to provide them with a certification of their mentorship, you know, that they've reached a certain standard of mentorship that Berkeley wants to certify, because I think it would be very valuable to those students, no matter what, graduate students, no matter which direction they go in. So that's something I'd like to see happen, but it's a kind of, you know, we're not that far along that we have such a thing, but there are some elements of it. The SMART program is one. And there's several programs around the campus which do this at smaller scale. I think it would be fascinating if we could, really very good for everybody if we learned how to do it at a larger scale, so that, you know, many graduate students got that experience. Because also graduate students need mentorship, and one of the best ways to be good at getting mentorship yourself is to offer it to others and learn how to, you know, what works for that will also maybe work for you as you're trying to receive mentorship. So there's many dimensions to your question, and I think it's a really deep one.
I think we had so many different ways that there's sort of different corners of the rug one has to pick up. And I feel that the line of questioning and everyone's responses picked up all those corners. And I do feel so affirmed that we have the leadership we do that is able to respond in this way to these questions, as well as people like Tom and Irene here over in DC, putting forward reports like we saw. And I do hope that Berkeley can be wind at the backs of what you're trying to do, and that you can be wind at the backs of us as well. I think we have more questions. I invite a few of you to come and speak to these individuals informally as we leave. But for now, I hope you'll collectively help me thank this incredible team of interlocutors.